So we talked about the aperture and the shutter, and now we need to put them together because we use them together. So when we look through the camera and compose our image, we lightly depress the shutter release button, and that activates the light meter. And the light meter, as we discussed, is a mechanism built into the camera that reads how much light is available, and taking that information and the ISO rating, it tells you or your camera how much light is required to make a proper exposure, one that's neither too light nor too dark. And so a display should show up in your viewfinder window, on the LCD up here, perhaps on the screen, the LCD screen at the back. And the light meter won't say, I divine that you should set your aperture at f8 and your shutter speed at 1/2000th of a second. It uses as a starting point wherever the camera happens to be set at that moment, and then it will tell you whether or not that is correct. And if it isn't, it will probably blink at you or something, and until you change either the aperture or the shutter speed or both, and until you reach the correct setting, and then the light meter will indicate that to you. And so presumably, if you use that setting, the image you make will be properly exposed, neither too light nor too dark. There will be many times, however, that even though you believe that your light meter is working correctly, you may not want to use that particular setting. And so I want to talk about that. So let us say that your shutter speed is set to a 60th of a second and the aperture at f8. You have your ASA or ISO set to 400, and you're outside and you activate the light meter, and miraculously that happens to be the correct setting. And so if you use a 60th of a second at f8, your image will be properly exposed. But perhaps you don't want to use a 60th of a second at f8. I want to talk about the effect of the shutter on images. And so, as you can see, there are many shutter speeds that we can make use of. And the reason that we'd want to change the shutter speed, aside from wanting to change the amount of light entering the camera, has to do with motion. And so if you're photographing something that's moving, you may want to stop the motion or freeze the motion of that object, or perhaps you want to show the motion. So let's say you are at a tennis match. I usually use tennis examples. And you're watching Rafael Nadal serve a tennis ball at 125 miles an hour. And you want to capture that tennis ball just after it leaves his racket. So it's moving very, very quickly. And in order to make the image that you want, to have that fast-moving ball frozen midair, you need to use a really fast shutter speed. If you use a slower shutter speed, that ball it's gone, so you won't see it. Conversely, let's say you want to show the motion of something. Trees, blowing in the wind, water moving, a dancer pirouetting across a stage, Lionel Messi kicking a soccer ball, and you want to show that the soccer ball is moving. In those cases, you would want to use a slow shutter speed, one where the shutter remains open for a longer period of time. Because for however long the shutter remains open, whatever's going on in front of the camera will be recorded. And if that something is something moving, then the motion will be recorded. In either case, fast shutter speed or slow shutter speed, a 60th of a second won't really cut it. It's not that I have anything against a 60th of a second, but it's kind of in between. It's neither fast nor slow. So if you want to freeze the motion of something moving very quickly, a 60th of a second is not fast enough. And if you want to show the motion of something moving, then a 60th of a second is probably too fast. Excuse me. But we know that when we change the shutter speed, we change the amount of light entering the camera. So if we want to use, instead of a 60th of a second, 1/125th of a second, then we're going from a slower to a faster shutter speed. The shutter remains open for less time, and it therefore lets in less light. So 1/125th of a second lets in half as much light as a 60th of a second. 1/250th of a second lets in a quarter as much light, and so on. And so the images will get darker and darker as we stop down the shutter speed. Conversely, if we go to a slower shutter speed, to a 30th of a second instead of a 60th of a second, a 30th of a second remains open for twice as long as a 60th of a second, and it therefore lets in twice as much light. So then our image will be overexposed. Now, obviously, photographers make use of these shutter speeds. And so what we do is we change the size of the aperture when we change the shutter speed to compensate for that change in the amount of light entering the camera. So if I change the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, I've cut the amount of light in half, and I will compensate for that by changing my aperture from a smaller to a larger aperture. So in this case, from f8 to f5.6. Now I want to point out that these numbers that you see here are hypothetical. They're possibilities in this made-up situation that I'm giving you here. So don't memorize these combinations of numbers, but do memorize how we figure them out. So now I have my shutter speed set at 1/125th of a second and my aperture at f5.6. This combination of numbers lets in the same overall amount of light as a 60th of a second at f8 does. In the second case, I'm letting less light in through the shutter and more light in through the aperture. But overall, the amount of light is the same. And so these are called equivalent exposures. And we can now fill in the rest. So at 1/250th of a second, I'll use f4. At 1/500th of a second, I'll use f2.8. At 1/1000th of a second, I'll use f2. Now my lens doesn't open up beyond f2. And so 1/1000th of a second is the fastest shutter speed that I can make use of on my camera in this situation. If I had a lens that opened up to the next whole stop, which is f1.4, then I could make use of 1/2000th of a second. If my lens doesn't open up beyond, let's say, f2.8, then 1/500th of a second would be the fastest shutter speed I could make use of. In the opposite direction, if I go to the slower shutter speed, so if I change my shutter speed from a 60th of a second to a 30th of a second, again, I'm now letting in twice as much light as the light meter says is correct. And so to compensate for that, I will change the aperture from a larger to a smaller aperture. So again, remember that the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the diameter of the aperture, and the larger the f-stop number, the smaller the diameter. So in this case, when I change from a 60th of a second to a 30th of a second, I'll change the aperture from f8 to f11 to compensate for the change in the amount of light entering the camera through the shutter. And now I can fill in these numbers as well. A 15th of a second at f16, an eighth of a second at f22. My lens doesn't stop down beyond f22, but many of your lenses will. They'll go to the next whole stop aperture, which is f32. And if my lens stopped down to f32, I could make use of a quarter of a second. So I have all of these equivalent exposures available to me. Each one of these combinations of numbers lets in the same overall amount of light as my original light meter reading. So 1/1000th of a second at f2 will stop motion. It will also have something called shallow depth of field, which will be the next topic. And then over here on the other end, an eighth of a second at f22, an eighth of a second will allow me to show motion. And the depth of field, which again is affected by the aperture, the depth of field will be great. Now, let's say that I want to make use of these really slow shutter speeds. My lens doesn't stop down beyond f22, and so if I change the shutter speeds to these even slower shutter speeds, a quarter of a second, a half second, my camera will probably allow me to do that, even if it's a more automatic camera of this sort rather than this film camera. I can still change the shutter speeds, but now I no longer have f-stops to compensate for that, and so I'll be overexposing. I'll double the amount of light that's required and then quadruple it and so on. So let's say I'm outside, I'm photographing, I can't change how much light I have, I'm relying on the sun, and this is the only equipment I have. One thing I can change is the ASA, or the ISO rating. So it's set at 400 now, and if I want to make use of the slower shutter speeds that let in more light, I would want to change the ISO rating to one that is less sensitive, so a lower number. And that is because the less sensitive the film or sensor is, the more light it requires to make a proper exposure. And I want to let in more light by using one of these slower shutter speeds. So here is what happens when I change the ISO rating. So let's say change it from 400 to 200. And you can think of the ISO ratings as stops. If I change the rating from 400 to 200, I've cut the sensitivity in half. And remember that the relationships are inversely proportional. So when I decrease the sensitivity, I will require more light. So I've cut the sensitivity in half. I therefore require twice as much light. And so when I change the ISO rating, then the light meter will beep at me and say, you're not letting in the correct amount of light. Now you are underexposing with the aperture at f8 and the shutter speed at a 60th of a second. And so I need to let more light in. And so I am going to change the aperture. In overall terms, it doesn't matter if you change the aperture or the shutter speed. But right now I'm dealing more with the shutter speed, so I'll change the aperture, and I'll change it from f8 to f5.6, so I'll let in twice as much light. to compensate for the fact that I've changed the ISO rating. So now all of my numbers shift over by 1. Instead of a 60th of a second at f8, I'll use a 60th of a second at f5.6. And then 1/125th of a second at f4, 1/250th of a second at f2.8, and 1/500th of a second at f2. I can no longer make use of 1/1000th of a second at f2. So I've lost 1 stop on the fast end of things. But if we look to the other end, I've gained 1 stop at the slow end of things. So because the numbers shifted over, now I have a 30th of a second at f8, a 15th of a second at f11, an 1/8 of a second at f16, and a 1/4 of a second at f22. So now I can make use of a 1/4 of a second. And if that's not enough, if I want to go to a 1/2 second, then I will change the ISO rating from 200 to 100. And the same thing, we'll do the same thing again and shift over by one stop. And so I'll again lose one stop in the fast shutter speeds. So now 1/250th of a second will be the fastest shutter speed I can make use of at f2. But I can now make use of 1/2 a second at f22. And so in this way, I can make use of these different equivalent exposures. If I wanted to make use of the faster shutter speeds, then I would go to a higher ISO rating, a more sensitive rating that requires less light. Okay,